Conversations with Ina and Martin, Carl Gustav Jung's Aion, the researches into the phenomenology of the self. Chapter 4, the most important chapter on the self. Good day, Ina. How are you doing today?
I'm great, Martin. How are you? I'm looking forward to this
Wonderful.
chapter.
Yeah, we've been studying for 3 weeks, preparing for this one. And it's been interesting how it has forced us to really grow and how it's been really synchronously ever present in our work, huh?
Yes, yes,
Quite amazing how the process works, huh?
absolutely. I said, the ripple effect of the texts, and as we study them and as we dive in, and that's, definitely would encourage our viewers to give it a shot on their own, not just through our slides, but actually sentence by sentence, and allow the sentences to sit with them within their soul consciousness and allow it to do the work that it's meant to do. Um,
That's the intention of our videos is to support and facilitate and encourage the study
Absolutely.
of Carl Jung's work. Want to acknowledge our viewers and how important they are to us and how important it
Mhm.
is for you to subscribe and to ask questions. We In the last
Mhm.
week, I've had a number of my clients reach out and say how wonderful your presence is, Ina, in the Healer and
Oh,
the Dreamer Astrology, and
mm.
how rewarding this has been for our viewers. And so please do share with your circle and please do subscribe and we'll keep it coming. This is a most important chapter, the self, and just to go ahead.
Absolutely. I feel the same way. It's almost like all the prior chapters of the ego and the shadows and the syzygy, they're all coming together to facilitate this chapter 4. And um, how important for our psyche to understand the dance between all the archetypes and how they come together. And of course, what it does, it actually to our ego.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this chapter, he kind of establishes some very important principle in his psychology, and then these first four chapters they lay as a foundation to the rest of this exploration that is this book Aion. Again, Aion was all written as a book and released as a book itself, and as an astrologer, and then I was studying, I read past chapter 4 into chapter 5 and 6 and 7, and trying to decide how we're going to present that material and how important astrologically that material is. And so I'm really excited about that. But first, we're going to go into the archetype of the self. And
Correct.
here we go. Um, we're going to go to slide number 1. Okay, here we go.
Yep.
We shall now turn to the question of whether the increase in self-knowledge resulting from the withdrawal of impersonal projections, in other words, the integration of the contents of the collective unconscious, exerts a specific influence on the ego personality. This is we can almost hear him speak, huh? Mr. Jung. It's impossible to read Jung and not to develop a special affinity for him. Do you feel more and more close to Carl Jung?
I definitely, as I said in my prior videos, doing this this book with you feels that I'm falling in love with him literally sentence by sentence. I mean, each word has so much depth and meaning because I can connect to the process and what does he actually mean by each word in each sentence. And the
Right.
depth of it is just,
It's mind-blowing, really.
it is mind blowing. Absolutely.
So let's dissect this sentence here. The contents of the collective unconscious exerts a specific influence on the ego personality. So we become influenced by the contents of the unconscious as we dive into the work,
Mm-hmm.
to the extent that the integrated contents are part of the self. We can expect this influence to be considerable. Their assimilation augments not only the area of the field of consciousness, but also the importance of the ego, especially when, as usually happens, the ego lacks any critical approach to the unconscious. That's really important, huh? When we do this work and we see, on the path of spiritual realization that there are many, many dangers. And one of these dangers is identifying with the archetypes, identifying with the contents of the unconscious. When we do the work, our consciousness increases. And as our consciousness increases, it boosts not only our spiritual relationship with the self, but it also boosts the ego.
Mm-hmm.
So that sometimes in our spiritual practices, we boost the ego, but we lack what he calls the critical approach to the unconscious. In other words, we have to be able to discriminate. And this he's going to talk about a lot more. In that case, it is easily overpowered and becomes identical with the contents that have been assimilated. In this way, for instance, a masculine consciousness comes under the influence of the anima and can even be possessed by her.
Mm.
This is something that we run into a lot, anima possession and animus possession. For a man to be possessed by the anima, one starts identifying with the feminine side of his personality. And we see this is very common in our times. Or for a woman to identify with the animus and her masculine side. And really, these things are an epidemic at this time in our evolution, huh? That we have lost the discrimination to see the contents of the unconscious as being separate from the ego. We even talk about letting go of the ego, huh? Which is interesting because then we become completely overwhelmed by contents from the unconscious.
Correct.
So in that sense, Jung really voices a very important warning, huh?
Absolutely. That inflation of the ego from the work that you're doing, because as you get the work, you get this sense of liberation. And as you get the sense of liberation, ego wants to identify with it because it gives him a sense of power. It thinks, oh my God, now I can own this one, and look at me, what I've done. Look at what I have discovered about myself, and you want to tell the world about it, and you want to share it, and it begins to fly high, if you will. Only to realize that at that particular moment it gets possessed by an archetype itself.
We're
And this is where we do need to stand on guard for thee.
mm-hmm. We're going to look at that in more details here. So the more numerous, and this is a beautiful picture from an alchemical woodcut that I got from Jung's books, and
Mm-hmm.
it is an astrological depiction of the process of individuation. And you look in every corner, and there's huge stories, and so That's the contents of the unconscious. So the more numerous and the more significant the unconscious contents, which are assimilated by the ego, the closer the approximation of the ego to the self, even though this approximation must be a never-ending process. You know, that to put that into metaphysical terms, we feel closer and closer to God, but we never become God. We
Mhm.
become related to him. This inevitably produces an inflation of the ego unless a critical line of demarcation is drawn before it and the unconscious figures.
Mhm.
But this act of discrimination yields practical results only if it succeeds in fixing reasonable boundaries to the ego
Mhm.
and in granting the figures of the unconscious, the self, the anima, the animus, and the shadow, relative autonomy and reality of a psychic nature. What do you see in that?
Three sentences really jumped out: that the ego assimilates the content of the unconsciousness the closer the ego gets to the self.
Mm-hmm.
This process can overtake us, and we could begin to identify with the process rather than assimilation.
Mm-hmm.
And then the discrimination process keep the ego in check with its process rather than being taken over by it. So this that's what I was pointing towards. I've experienced in the last couple of days quite a big surge of energy, and keep myself in reflective mode and objective mode rather than sort of spinning out of control emotionally. um, Sort of gave me a sense of a discriminative rhythm of a process.
Right. And learning to put boundaries, this is who
Exactly.
I am, and these are the contents of the unconscious.
Exactly.
So to really learn how to do that, if you're interested in that subject matter, Jung did a great book with the Richard Wilhelm. This was printed in the 40s. This is called The Secret of the Golden Flower, Richard Wilhelm and Carl Jung. It's a beautiful book about a Chinese book of life. It's a book of Chinese yoga, and Jung discusses this in great details. What happens on the spiritual path? This book was printed in the 40s, and it's never been out of print. Great little book. One of the most important books if you're interested in spirituality. And Jung, The Secret of the Golden Flower. That was just a little uh, um, step aside, and here we keep going. Did you ever chance to read that book, The Secret of the Golden Flower?
Yes, I have. Yes, I love it.
Wonderful. So the projection making factor, for instance, as undeniable reality. Anyone who insists on denying it becomes identical with it. That's big, huh? Which is not
Exactly.
only dubious in itself, but a positive danger to the well-being of the individual. So if you don't see with your discrimination that the projection making factor, what we talked about earlier in the last video, Maya, illusion, if you identify with that projection making factor, which creates the dreams, which creates the visions, that it has an undeniable reality. Anyone who insists on denying it becomes identical with it. We actually become possessed by it, which is not only dubious in itself, but a positive danger to the well-being of the individual.
Mm.
Everyone who has dealings with such cases know how perilous an inflation can be. In general, we are not directly conscious of this condition at all, but can at best infer its existence indirectly from the symptoms. It must be reckoned a psychic catastrophe when the ego is assimilated by the self. The image of wholeness then remains in the unconscious, so that on the one hand, it shares in the archaic nature of the unconscious, and in the other finds itself into cyclically relative time and space and time continuum that is characteristics of the unconscious as such.
So that second part of the quote, the image of the wholeness then remains in the unconscious. I think I struggle the most with it.
Well, in this is really difficult to understand. So in the Secret of the Golden Flower, Jung explains it, and also in the transference essay in volume 16, on the essay on the transference, he talks about what happens when we do the work, so we do our meditations, we do our practice, we do our searches, we do our card readings, we do all of these practices, try to understand the unconscious. If we identify with that unconscious too much, we become possessed by it. When we do these practices, when we do your yoga, when we do all of these things, it gives us energy. And we have a tendency to identify with that energy.
Correct.
And if we identify with it, we become inflated.
Correct.
Inflated is puffed up, It's like we become bigger than we are, and we like that feeling, and we sometimes even get attached to it. And so if we identify it with too much, we become possessed by it, so that we have to understand that what comes from the work, it's this increase in consciousness. We have to learn to put proper boundaries in it.
Right.
If not, if we allow it to, then it becomes
Take over by the beast.
It becomes a beast, exactly. It possesses us, and as he was explaining in this, as you're pointing out, this it must reckon a psychic catastrophe when the ego is assimilated by the self. So then one has no concept. One thinks he has become the self. Like, one of the most common is the identification as guru or as shaman, starts identifying with the archetype of the unconscious and becomes assimilated by it. The result of that is the image of wholeness then remains in the unconscious, so that on the one hand, it shares in the archaic nature of the unconscious, and in the other finds itself into psychically relative time-space continuum that is characteristics of the unconscious as such. So what happens then is one becomes unadapted to the world, and one identifies with the contents of the unconscious, and there's something really strange. It becomes archaic, so then the person starts neglecting his appearance, and neglecting, we had these experiences in the 60s, where people would not bathe, and would not, they would become possessed and identify with contents of the unconscious, and they would become archaic in their behavior. They would become kind of caveman-like, or see it in the shamans who have a real dark natural side to them, that's archaic, so then that comes from the image of wholeness. Then go ahead.
Identifying with the unconscious more than the reality that surrounds you.
Exactly. So that's a catastrophe. We learn,
Mhm.
so what basically Jung is saying in the beginning of the chapter is he's saying, well, be very careful in this process of realizing the self. There are problems that are created if we identify the ego is assimilated by the self, and then that becomes very dangerous because then we become lost in the time and space continuum. We become disoriented and we become kind of archaic. We become possessed. We see people that start completely identifying, so they let go of their ego and they become assimilated by the self.
Mhm. Mhm.
And that is then the self becomes, then the personality becomes archaic,
Mhm.
and develops mannerism that
Mhm.
are symptomatic of an inflation, and also of a possession. It's very interesting, huh? So that's one of the things that we we ward about, or that Jung warns us about. And then he talks about, if therefore the ego falls for any length of time under the control of an unconscious factor, its adaptation is disturbed and the way opens for all sorts of possible accidents. Hence, it is of the
Correct.
greatest importance that the ego should be anchored in the world of consciousness, and that consciousness should be reinforced by a very precise adaptation. For this, certain virtues like attention, conscientiousness, patience, etc., are all of great value on the moral side, just as accurate observation of the symptomology of the unconscious and objective self-criticism are valuable on the intellectual side. So what is he saying here?
Well, as you were talking and as I'm I'm listening, it's amazing how when I read it on my own and then as you and I start processing it together, what shows up for me. And it's almost like when you were just reading this last quote, it made me feel like there is this dance and we stand in the middle between the conscious and the unconscious, and how we must, the discrimination comes in is for us to stand right in the middle of it and still send the intention of the for the consciousness and where it needs to go, and at the same time be willing to face the, what lurks in the shadow of our unconsciousness and in our psyche as it comes into, like as it, you know comes bearing gifts in the dream through symbolism.
Well,
And
that's exactly what he warns us about, is to start getting lost in between the ego and the self.
yes,
We have to be anchored in the ego. We
correct,
have to understand that the center of the ego, and being really aware, and being, so he talks about being really well defined as an ego,
correct.
so that we don't become overwhelmed by being unconscious. He talks about these very clear boundaries, and that we do that through two things: emotionally, through good habits, and through moral qualities where I don't identify with these things and I'm well adapted to the world of the material world, so that means that I know what my place is in the world, and so really strengthening my ego and developing good organization, keeping a clean house, an organizing work career, all of those things that make us really feel ingrained into our ego. We don't want to give that up, because then we identify with the self too much and then we become possessed by it, and then all kinds of bad things will happen from that. right? And so and we see, that if we identify and we become inflated, then the result is that we have uncontrollable um depressions. The
Mhm.
way to know that if I'm inflated is to realize that whenever I'm inflated, the deflation and the depression is right around the corner. It's what we call manic depressive, right? You get all
That's right.
manic, you get all possessed by
Mhm.
this increase in consciousness, and you think you've become God, and then it's not, it's only a little slip that will bring you back to human, and then you go, oh
I'm still human.
my God. Yeah. It's like, oh, catastrophe. And so so this is important stuff to realize, isn't it?
As I'm listening to you, I think in Suzuki, he says, if you don't know what to do, go back to your shadows.
uh, it's very difficult to go to these levels of awareness
Mhm.
without using tremendous amount of power of discrimination,
Yes.
objective self-criticism, and looking at the symptoms. Oh, I'm all inflated, and the
Yep.
dreams are great with that. If you work with your dreams will tell you, oh, you're all inflated, get back to earth, the flying dreams or the crashing dreams. I had a great dream uh today where last night, where the shadow was trying to break the neck of the feminine of my anima, and it wasn't successful, so and interesting, how the unconscious always seeks to compensate and to give you what it is that you need in
Mhm.
the process. Okay, so then there's the other side of this. Okay, so however, accentuation of the ego personality and the world of consciousness may easily assume such proportions that the figures of the unconscious are psychologized, and the self consequently becomes assimilated with the ego. So this is the opposite. Although this is the exact opposite of the process we are just described, it is followed by the same result, inflation. So in the first case, we had the ego allowed this complete identification with the self and became possessed by the self.
Mhm.
Now the ego psychologizes
Mhm.
all of the contents of the unconscious and becomes like a real materialist, becomes like really like identifies with the God of this world. So he's super into it. We see people that are influenced with such a sense of confidence in themselves that they think they really are God in this world. They have integrated the contents of the unconscious into the ego. So, although this is the exact opposite, it's the same thing. It's an inflation. The world of consciousness must now be leveled down in favor of the reality of the unconscious. So one was too unconscious, too, in the first case, allowed
Mhm.
the self to overrun the ego. In this case, now the ego has overrun the unconscious, and then now it's in trouble, but the other way around. In the first case, reality had to be protected against an archaic, external, and ubiquitous dream state. In the second, room must be made for the dream at the expense of the world of consciousness.
Mhm.
In the
That's a
first
very
case,
important sentence out of this whole thing.
yes. So let's repeat that.
Reality had to be protected against an archaic, eternal, and ambiguous dream state, and the second, room must be made for a dream at the expense of the world of consciousness. Beautiful sentence.
So one becomes possessed, by a dream, and becomes
Mhm.
completely inflated. So, these two connections with the unconscious, they're actually to be guarded against. So
Mhm.
here, before Jung really describes the archetype of the self, he says, be careful because you can either allow the unconscious and the self to completely snuff out the ego, or
Mhm.
you can have the ego completely own up to the contents of the unconscious and then become, so there are two types of inflation, and we see them very commonly. And so then in the first case, mobilization of all virtues is indicated. So you got to get your act together spiritually and really adapt to the world. And the other, the presumption of the ego can only be dampened by moral defeat. That means that really, if you're really identified with the with the content of the unconscious and your ego really fully identifies with it, so you've become God in a sense, then boom, there will be moral defeat. That's the only way. This is necessary because otherwise one will never attain the median degree of modesty, which is essential for the maintenance of a balanced state. And
That's the key.
that's the key. If you're going to do this work and going to be successful, you have to be humble. You
Mhm.
have to be modest. You
Mhm.
can't think too highly of yourself,
Mhm.
and you got to be kind of in service. So that's like really, you know, the preparation to getting into the really special work that comes towards the end of the chapter. How does
Correct.
how does that resonate with you, my dear?
I keep envisioning dance between the unconscious and the conscious. And how, like you said, you got to be humble rather than because I can, from my own personal experience, I know when um when everything around me in the conscious world begins to be in flow, and I'm like, oh my god, this confirmation, this and that, and how I have to pull myself back and say, okay, no, we still have to do the work, still something is showing up, and then I dive into the unconscious, and then I get completely hermit like, and I don't want to see the conscious world. I want to be away from it because I want to go deep. I want to go inside. I don't want to be distracted. And in either cases, humbleness just goes out the window because, you just want to somehow gain the control of it.
Beautiful, beautiful. That's exciting. That's I think we've got that.
I'm glad you're enjoying it, Martin.
Well, we're getting there. We're getting there. We're moving along the path here. We have a lot of work still ahead here. So, all in all, it is not only more beneficial, but more correct psychologically to explain as the will of God the natural forces that appear in us as instincts. In this way, we find ourselves living in harmony with the habitus of our ancestral psychic life. That is, we function as men have functioned at all times and in all places. That's big, isn't it?
Hmm.
So the will of God. So then we see the what happens to us and these projections that we're projecting on others, we see them as direct expression of the will of God. And so he'll define this further as we go along. Psychological truths are not metaphysical insights. They are visual modes of thinking, feeling, and behaving which experience has proved appropriate and useful. So,
Right. So this is by this sentence, he points towards the dream world, right?
well, also what he's saying is that I'm not, when I say the will of God, I'm not being metaphysical here. I'm being psychological.
Mm-hmm.
No, this is, Jung always considers himself as a scientist and empiricist. He used the empirical method to
Mm-hmm.
arrive at his conclusions. And
Mm-hmm.
so this is really important, understanding his work, that he sees this not from a metaphysical perspective, but from a perspective of healing the soul or healing the psyche, because Jung was a psychologist and psychiatrist. And
Mm-hmm.
this here he defines what he means. So when I say that the impulses which we find in ourselves should be understood as the will of God, I wish to emphasize that they are not to be regarded as an arbitrary wishing and willing, but as absolutes which one must learn to handle correctly. The will can control them only in part. It may be able to suppress them, but it cannot alter the nature of what is suppressed. Comes up again, and oops, sorry. The will can control them only in part. It may be able to suppress them, but it cannot alter their nature. And what is suppressed comes up again in another place, in an altered form, but this time loaded with the resentment that makes the otherwise harmless natural impulse our enemy. So we need to flesh that out here. So, so what he's talking about in terms of the will of God is not something that's arbitrary or wishing and willing. This is about something that's absolute, and that we can say, we can deny by an act of will. So if we deny the natural impulse or the will of God, then the will of God becomes manifest in another way, which is harmless, which becomes our enemy. So that we see a lot, in psychological analysis, we see that sometimes the inner God has become the inner devil, in that because it's being rejected, or the calling of instinct as being rejected,
Mm-hmm.
then it has risen up against the individual as that shadow. So that the
Mm-hmm.
shadow is actually the inner God being angry because its dictates are not being heard. Does that make sense?
Well, it's hard to understand, but what you're saying, the way I understand what you're saying right now, that when we demonize parts of ourselves by use of will of God, will of power, and say, well, I don't like this about myself, I'm not willing to look at it, and this does not serve me, and whether I do this consciously or unconsciously makes a difference, but I sort of close the door, push it away out of me, and I close the door, and then eventually that part of me begins to control me from through the unconsciousness.
Well, let me give you an example. Let's say that it is my destiny, and we do that a lot in chart analysis. We're exploring the destiny of the individual. And
Mm-hmm.
let's say the individual has a destiny to give expression creatively
Mm-hmm.
to some kind of gift that has been inherited from the ancestral line.
Mm-hmm.
And we see this often.
Mm-hmm.
So that gift, that is the will of God, in a sense, that it's my destiny. I am to do this, but I deny it. I say no to it. By the
Mm-hmm.
act of saying no to that gift, that will of God, that gift, turns around and becomes a compulsion to negative distractions,
Whatever it is. Mm-hmm.
drug addictions, or all of the many choices of dark choices, that gift, that will of God, has become my enemy. Does that make sense to you?
Oh yes, now it does.
Okay, so then that's what Jung is saying here. And now that we understand that, we can get to the next part of the quote. So then, so that harmless natural impulse, which would be the creative impulse,
Mm-hmm.
becomes our enemy in this monstrous compulsion or neurosis. So then you're not listening to your gift, therefore you become compulsive, addictive personality disorder. It becomes your enemy, but it's actually your creative gift. Then he
Mm-hmm.
explains what he means by the term God. I should also like the term God and the phrase the will of God to be understood not so much in the Christian sense as in the sense intended by Diotima. And that's what is so far out about Jung, is that the studies are so profound that every once in a while he brings up these incredible individuals. And so Diotima is a woman philosopher from the time of Socrates. She said, Eros, dear Socrates, is a mighty daimon. And me and you, we've talked about this word, daimon, a lot. It's that will of God. It's a daimon. It's like, to use that example, that creative expression of the ancestral gift is the daimon that has become possessing you, as starting to possess you because it's not being heard.
On
So,
being expressed. Mm-hmm.
so the Greek words daimon and daimonium express a determining power which comes upon man from the outside, like providence or fate or destiny. Though the ethical decision is left to man, he must know, however, what he is deciding about and what he is doing. Then, if he obeys, he is following not just his own opinion, and if he rejects, he is destroying not just his own intention. So to unwrap this, to unpack it, what's that saying is that this force of destiny, this daimon. So when we study astrology and we do a person's chart, that daimon, and with us, you've gotten to know the daimon within you, what we've classified as the daimon of the ancestral line. It's actually seeking to be expressed, like now you're starting to write poetry, you're starting to make art that expresses that daimon. And in your current crisis, what you're going through, you're projecting that daimon on individuals in your relationships, and you're saying this is what's going on, but actually it's the daimon that
Mm-hmm.
is seeking to be expressed.
Mm-hmm.
So that's experienced as a destiny or a fate, and we have the choice. I can accept it willingly and surrender to it, or I can deny it, but it's my choice. So, in a sense, that relationship, we can either, it has to be a conscious relationship where, okay, like I used to say, about Pluto's the archetype of the great mother. And so, it's very significant in my chart. So I've been, it's like she's been dragging me by the hair, kicking and screaming. And at a particular moment in my progress, I realized that I could go willingly and it'd be a lot less painful. So that's the free choice that we have. We can go willingly on the path, or destiny can manifest itself in a harsh way to get us. The result's going to be the same in the end. How did that settle with you?
I think it's hitting me on a different level.
It's kind of far out how it really speaks really personally, this material, huh?
Yes.
Okay, so then the next one. We're only about halfway through, so be patient with us. And you can always pause and come back, or you can replay, till you get it, what it's saying. And also, if you're watching this and you would really like to have these slides, I can send them to you very easily. Just reach out. There's my email at the end of the session here. So in all of this, so in everything that we've explored so much, talked about so much so far, Jung then goes into this. He says the purely biological or scientific standpoint falls short in psychology because it is in the main intellectual only. The psychic phenomena cannot be grasped in its totality by the intellect, for it consists not only of meaning, but also of value. And this depends on the intensity of the accompanying feeling tones. So this is really important. So Jung says that, just rationally with your head, you're not going to get all this. It's impossible to get this because we have to use the feeling. So now we go into Jungian psychology and what the astrology calls the four elements. And in Jungian psychology, they're the functions. So we have thinking, we have feeling. Thinking in astrology is the air element, and feeling in the elements of astrology, it's water. So we have air and water, and then the other two functions, sensation, earth, and fire, intuition. Jung separates these two. He says thinking and feeling are rational function. So at least two rational functions are needed in order to map out anything like a complete diagram of a given psychic content. So the feeling value, so the water element, to feel to it, so that's, we think that we can only figure this thing out by thinking. But, for anybody who's worked with me, for any extensive period of time, or even for just one reading, I'm never asking the individual, what do you think? I'm also always asking, what do you feel? And so this feeling, or this water element, this feeling tone, feelings are the voice of the soul. The soul doesn't express itself in rational thinking, it expresses itself in feeling value. And it's very difficult for the rational thinking to listen to the feeling value. So then when we're asking, how do you feel? There's a feeling value. A feeling value is expressed as the emotions that come up, like you're doing a reading with someone and you're working with it, and all of a sudden you push a button and then the feelings come up. Or like in a dream, there will be a very intense feeling. I'm crying or I'm grieving, the feeling value, the feeling tone, Jung calls it. That is that is essential in the realization of the self. The feeling value is a very important criteria which psychology cannot do without, because it determines in large measure the role which the content will play in the psychic economy. So the feeling charge tells us how important the content is, so that you recognize the archetype through the feeling tone, not through the rational. That is to say, the affective. So the effect, AFFECT, the effect is a psychological term, meaning, like when whenever I think of so and so, I start crying. Crying is the effect. It's not rational. The thinking element and the water element, they have a conversation. The water element feels, but the thinking has no idea what feeling is, and so it's talking a different language. So the affective values gives the measure of the intensity of an idea, and the intensity in its turn expresses the idea's energetic tension, its effective potential. This is really important. The feeling value, it indicate what's really going on here. So then I'm disturbed, because of a relationship with somebody that's turning, and I'm feeling all of these emotions. The emotions perceived objectively and subjectively, as we discussed, I can understand that what's being triggered in me is an archetypal story. It's the daimon. So the shadow, for instance, usually had this decidedly negative feeling, while the anima, like the animus, as a more positive one. Whereas the shadow is accompanied by more or less definite and describable feeling tones, the anima and the animus exhibit feeling qualities that are harder to define. Mostly they are felt to be fascinating or numinous. How do you feel about that one?
Really? We didn't talk enough about me.
What I'm
um,
saying though is intellectually, I don't want to put you on the spot.
yeah, but you did. It's okay. I think that in my process, the surge of emotions and the surge of feelings helps me to keep um, the discrimination as a forefront.
Right. In being more general about it and less personal,
Mhm.
it is a fact of reality in our day and age that we
Mhm.
empower the rational thinking function, and
Mhm.
that most people are not connected to their feeling nature.
Correct.
And
Correct.
because they're not connected to their feeling nature is kind of archaic. It's
Correct.
kind of undeveloped.
Correct.
And then it throws out all kinds of really nasty emotions,
Correct.
keeps them up at night,
Mhm.
depression, all of these, they're
Mhm.
feeling tones because we don't know the language of feelings. If you want
Mhm.
to become good at analyzing dreams, if you want to be good at doing any of this work, you got to be making peace with the feeling nature.
Mhm.
And we're all dominated by an intellectual, approach, and so to have, it's not an easy victory to get to have a dialogue between the emotions and the thinking. But if we can have that balance, then we can figure it out. So what Jung is saying is that there is a lot of difficulties on the path. You can identify with the unconscious, or you can be possessed by it. And the only way you're going to figure it out is if you can have the discriminating power of the intellect and the feeling nature, and to learn to balance the water and the air element. So then the biggest challenge we face in our own process is to get out of our heads and get into our feelings and learn to see what our feelings are saying. And that will give us the realizations that the intellect is looking for, right? So then that's what Jung is saying, is that the balance between the two is how you navigate the
How you
archetype
propel
without
forward.
being possessed by them.
Correct.
Does that make sense?
100%.
And it is both personal and collective.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. We're making some progress here, huh? That's like powerful stuff, ain't it?
Then isn't that the reason we're doing this?
Absolutely. Well, we're doing this for our own sake, right? So now we're getting into dream work, and now we're getting into the fun stuff, where the collective idea is represented in a dream by a lowly aspect of itself, is certainly the more frequent. The goddess appears as a black cat, and the deity as the lapis exilis, the stone with no worth. So now, you can't go very far in Jungian psychology without getting to the subject of dream analysis. So
Right.
everything so far has been to build up his case as to how do we develop a feeling a feeling, but also a thinking relationship. And so now the unconscious, it's like a tricky, it's paradoxical. So it expresses itself as the goddess can be a black cat in a dream, or the deity a little stone of no worth. Interpretation then demands a knowledge of certain things which have less to do with zoology and mineralogy than with the existence of an historical consensus omnium in regard to the object in question.
Mhm.
These mythological aspects are always present, even though in a given case they may be unconscious.
Mhm.
What is that saying?
Uh, that the psyche always communicates with us, and we need to understand it mythologically as a mythological story. Like
So
as you read this, I remember this my last dream that I had, where for me, dogs show up a lot in my dreams, like a lot. And they're sometimes skimpy dogs, and they sometimes big dogs. Then there are dogs that are very timid and just on the side of the dream. They're not very important, but they're always there, and they're always doing something. Sometimes not doing, but just sitting and observing. And I think my last one I shared with you, we didn't have a chance to talk about it, but there was also diamond and granites in the dream as well, that is being looked at and purchased and this and that. And you have to understand that this is just like you said, it's not about.
and so then that's the emotional aspect, is that it allows you to see things mythologically.
Correct.
The symbol is the emotional voice of the archetype, so there's a charge in that. And so the emotional charge that is present in the dog, whatever that emotion is, that's what is being communicated. And so then we use the intellect to understand the message of the emotion.
Mhm.
So that's in dream work, but it's also in psychoanalysis when we observe the ongoing myth of the individual and how the individual is going through this particular crisis, and we learn to see it as a dream.
Mm.
And we learn to see it and to analyze it as we would, and to connect with the feeling tone, because the feeling tone will tell us what really is going on.
Mm.
That's powerful stuff.
Yes.
How are we doing so far?
Spectacular. I love it. I love the rhythm, and I love the how we're not rushing through it because it is a dense material.
Hallelujah to that. It's really intense. So let's see. So we find something which has the highest significance for the life of the unconscious, standing lowest on the scale of conscious values. That's
And
not
vice
only in
versa.
a dream, but a lot of times we don't give value to the things that are most important, and vice versa, and so that's the problem. That's so the dream shows, compensates the instability of the or the wrongdoings of the conscious attitudes.
Mhm.
As for
Instability was a
this,
good word.
what's that?
Instability was a good word.
Hmm. As for the self, it is completely outside the personal sphere, and appears, if at all, only as a religious mythologem, and its symbols ranges from the highest to the lowest. So in dream work, when we have dreams that look like mythology, like fairy tales,
Mhm.
that, and has a kind of a religious nature to it, then
Mhm.
that's when the self starts to become manifest. So we have the anima and the animus dreams, we have the shadow dreams, and when the dream starts looking like a religious mythology, then that's when the self starts speaking.
Mhm.
What is more, psychopathology knows with tolerable certainty that what the unconscious can do to the conscious, and for this reason devotes to the
To the
unconscious
unconscious.
an attention that often seems incomprehensible to the layman.
I'm
So
into
this
that.
whole concept of the unconscious and paying attention to what's going on unconsciously,
Mm.
How you doing, my dear?
It's steering stuff for me.
Absolutely, it's how it goes, huh?
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
let's keep going
Keep
here.
going. Yeah, yeah, keep going.
So then, and it ties in really so beautifully with the work we've been doing, huh?
Mhm. Yes.
So then here we are now. The knowledge, this knowledge is an essential prerequisite for any integration. That is to say, a content can only be integrated when its double aspect has become conscious, when it is grasped not merely intellectually, but understood according to its feeling value. You can't just understand something, you gotta feel it too. And that's really important, especially as we go along in this chapter here. Intellect and feeling, however, are difficult to put in one harness. They conflict with one another by definition. Whoever identifies with an intellectual standpoint will occasionally find his feeling confronting him like an enemy in the guise of the anima. Conversely, an intellectual animist will make violent attacks on the feeling standpoint. Therefore, anyone who wants to achieve the difficult feat of realizing something, not only intellectually, but also according to its feeling value, must, for better or worse, come to grips with the animus problem in order to open the way for a higher union Conjunctio oppositorum, this is an indispensable prerequisite for wholeness. So this is a picture here is the anima and the animus into one body with the three and the one, the mercurial snake. This is the tree of the sun and the moon, and this is the soul, and it all lies on the moon and the crown of the sun. And so this is an alchemical, astrological picture expressing this wholeness and how this balance of anima and animus and the conjunctio oppositorum, that this divine union, the sacred marriage of the alchemists between the thinking and the feeling, the marriage of the thinking masculine and the feeling feminine within each of us, that's wholeness, or that's the doorway to wholeness. That's really big, huh? It's you've about halfway through the video, you really became the student, huh? You're writing
Uh,
your
Actually, it's not that I became a student. I think it humbled me.
beautiful, beautiful.
And it's not just that it's humbled me, it's also healing me, just like exactly what I needed.
That's what I was thinking as we were going along. You know, today we were having our session. I says, well, all we need to do is the video and everything will become clear.
Hmm.
Okay, what did I do not wrong? I did this wrong. Let's do that again. And you guys got to see my desktop. So we click on here and then we open. Yeah, you know, we don't have fancy technicians, and we don't do any editing, and what you see is what you get, and we're very personal, and we like it that way.
We
Well,
do.
not that we wouldn't like help, but hey, it's not stopping us from doing the work.
Amen.
So we got still quite a few slides. So let's so although wholeness seems at first sight to be nothing but an abstract idea like anima and animus, it is nevertheless empirical insofar as it is anticipated in this by the psyche in the forms of spontaneous or autonomous symbols. These are the quaternary or mandala symbols. Here's one of them here, and also an alchemical picture. But you saw throughout the video and throughout Jung's work, this quaternary or mandala symbols, which occur not only in the dreams of modern people who have never heard of them, but are widely disseminated in the historical record of many peoples and many epochs. Their significance as symbols of unity into totality is amply confirmed by history as well as by empirical psychology. What at first looks like an abstract idea stands in reality for something that exists and can be experienced, that demonstrates its a priori presence spontaneously. Wholeness is just an objective factor that confronts the subject independently of him, like anima or animus, and just as the latter have a higher position in the hierarchy than the shadow, so wholeness lays claim to a position and a value superior to those of the syzygy. The syzygy seems to represent at least a substantial portion of it, if not actually two halves of the totality formed by the royal brother-sister pair, and hence the tension of opposites from which the divine child is born as a symbol of unity.
Amen.
Yeah, huh? That's the right way to say amen. So that this from we go from the ego to the shadow, then we start conversing with the anima and the animus and trying to achieve a balance between the two. And when the balance, we actually get a marriage, and that sacred marriage is the archetype of the self and wholeness. And it is to be experienced. And once one experiences it, then it becomes real, not just intellectually, but feeling, right? Okay. And we keep going here. We could have easily done this in 2 videos, huh?
I was thinking the same thing, but it's okay.
Well, gladly our clients, our audience can see it in 2.
Exactly.
It's just that we're starting to run out of energy. Okay. So unity into totality stand at the highest point of the scale on the scale of objective values, because their symbols can no longer be distinguished from the imago Dei, the image of God. And all statements about the God image apply also to the empirical symbols of totality. Experience shows that individual mandalas are symbols of order, and that they occur in patients principally during times of psychic disorientation or reorientation. As magic circles, oops, as magic circles, they bind and subdue the lawless powers belonging to the world of darkness and depict or create an order that transforms the chaos into a cosmos.
Amen.
And so, this importance of astrology, and the mandala forms of astrology and transforming the chaos into cosmos, there's a real close relationship with the process of individuation and Jungian psychology and astrology. And throughout the whole of Jung's career, he referred to astrology numerous times. And so when we look at the mandala, then that is an intimation of the self, and which is what the chart does as well. The mandala at first comes into the conscious mind as an unimpressive point or dot, and a great deal of hard and painstaking work, as well as the integration of many projections, are generally required before the full range of symbol can be anything like completely understood. If this insight were purely intellectual, it could be achieved without much difficulty, for the worldwide pronouncements about the God within us and above us, about Christ and the corpus mysticum, the personal and suprapersonal Atman, etc., are all formulations that can be easily mastered by that cannot be easily mastered by the philosophic intellect. This is the common source of the illusion that one is then in possession of the thing. And so that means guarding against just an intellectual approach, but to actually do the work to realize the sacred unity. And this mandala drawing and this astrology and all this artwork that we do, and these symbols that show up. I know you were working on a spider web mandala at one point that came to you in a dream. So these are symbols of the process of individuation. In the course of the millennia, the reasoning mind has been given every opportunity to see to the futility of its conceit, though that has done nothing to prevent the intellectual mastery of a thing from being accepted as its face value. It is just because we understand something doesn't mean that we have realized it. In
Mhm.
philosophy, we have jnana and vijnana.
Mhm.
Jnana means knowledge, and vijnana is realized knowledge, or the difference between knowledge and wisdom, you know.
Mhm.
Wisdom is an emotional thing, you know, it's feeling value. It is precisely our experiences in psychology which demonstrates as plainly as could be wished that the intellectual grasp of a psychological fact produce no more than the concept of it, and that concept is no more than a name, a flatus vocis, a flat voice.
Mhm.
These intellectual counters can be bandied about easily enough. They pass slightly from hand to hand, for they have no weight or substance. They sound full but are hollow, and though purporting to designate a heavy task, an obligation, they commit us to nothing. The intellect is undeniably useful in its own field, but is a great cheat and illusionist outside of it whenever it tries to manipulate values. So then we go really deeper and deeper into the importance of the feelings, you know, bringing the feelings in. How do you feel about all of this? Wow, I'm overwhelmed. That's a lot to consider. You know, from a feeling value in contemplating everything that's going on, we can actually be humble, you know? It's like, oh, this is a lot.
Absolutely, and naming your feelings and understanding your feelings. I've always have said that it's almost like a step one in this journey is to describe your own individual language to your feelings, and every one of us need to have a sort of a chronological experience, if you will, to understand what is the difference between um, anger and disappointment, let's say, or not just because of the volume of the feeling that is arising, but just simply understanding, identifying what is the difference between one and another within your own inner garden. And
Mm-hmm.
by doing that, you can then one can slowly begin to um, associate what is showing up in the dreams, understand what's happening around them and what emotions are arising and why they're arising. But first step first is by naming the emotions, always.
Yeah, beautiful,
And this work
beautiful.
requires patience, just like he said over and over again. One cannot assume that with one dream, with just because we understood our emotions, just because, we went and we got the astrological reading, and just because, this is an ongoing process. And it's all about you becoming emotionally intelligent, mentally intelligent, and have the discrimination that is drumming the drum, and continue living your life and embrace what's coming at you, and remember to put those things together consciously. Absolutely, this is it.
Good for you, good for you, good for you. Powerful exploration, huh?
Hmm.
So then, whoa, 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 okay, all right. So this is the astrological mandala and the anima mundi, another picture from Jung's books. There are far more people who are afraid of the unconscious than one would expect. They are even afraid of their own shadow. And when it comes to the anima and the animus, the sphere turns into panic. For
Just
this,
like most of our listeners right now.
well, myself included, you know,
Oh,
the,
me too. Oh, me too.
for the CVG does indeed represent the contents that erupt into consciousness in a psychosis.
Mhm.
The overcoming of this fear is often a moral achievement of unusual magnitude, and it is yet not the only condition that must be fulfilled on the way to a real experience of the self. The shadow, the syzygy, and the self are psychic factors of which an adequate picture can be formed only on the basis of a fairly thorough experience of them. Just as these concepts arose out of an experience of reality, so then can be elucidated only by further experience. Philosophical criticism will find everything to object to in them unless it begins by recognizing that they are concerned with facts and that the concept is simply an abbreviated description of or definition of these facts. What did you get out of that?
Well, this actually made me feel that, made me think that how we sometimes, interact with certain individuals in our life, and we say, you know what, this person, we're different people because they don't understand what I'm talking about. They don't want to hear what I'm here to offer, and they're stirring up shit within me that I really don't really want to face. So I'm not going to be friends with them. And just as an example, right?
Mm-hmm.
And by doing that, we're actually sublimating. We're running away what is arising within us because we think that it's the other person's fault for bringing this emotion within us. I was perfectly fine until this person showed up, right? And there is so much more that is at play here, and there is so much more that is coming to the surface in order for us to actually, give it work.
Well, now we're back to the ego and the shadow and the projections,
Hmm.
and then we've gone to the CZG,
Hmm.
and then and people are afraid of that. But then, what Jung says really clearly here is that, wow, it takes a long time to get there. And, you gotta like keep working at the dream work and keep working, developing this relationship. And as you go along, then this process of self-realization becomes real. It's so what Jung is teaching here is a scientific process towards self-realization. It's what Jungian psychology is about. It's actually a scientific process that it maps out the process of individuation. Outside narrower field of professional psychology, outside the narrower field of professional psychology, these figures meet with the oh, with an understanding from all who have any knowledge of comparative mythology. Sorry, that was a typo there. A couple of typos here and there. They have no difficulty in recognizing the shadow as an adverse representative of the dark tonic world, the figure whose characteristics are universal. The Syzygy is immediately comprehensible as the psychic prototype of all divine couples. So anybody who is educated in mythology can see that these things are always talked about in fairy tales and dreams and in religions. These are the devil and God and the divine couple. These are all part of one who is understanding, and not just in psychology. Finally, the self, on the account of its empirical peculiarities, proves to be the ideos, the idea behind the supreme idea of unity and totality that are in there, and that are there in all monotheistic and monistic systems. Regardless parallels is important because it is possible through them to relate so-called metaphysical concepts which has lost the root connection with the natural experience to living universal psychic processes so that they can recover their true original meaning. In this way, the connection is reestablished between the ego and the projected contents now formulated as metaphysical ideas. Once metaphysical ideas have lost the capacity to recall and evoke the original experience, they have that only become useless, but did not only become useless, but to be actual impediments on the road to a wider development. That's really big. So what Jung is saying is that just, we're approaching this from a psychological perspective, but anybody who has any kind of studies into different fields, especially mythology, can recognize all of these symbols as symbols that show up in religions and fairy tales and different traditions, and they're always there. And that these symbols in religions, they become stagnant when they're not realized. In other words, if it's just an intellectual thing and we don't take the time to feel through the process, so that what we're experiencing in our dreams, what we're experiencing in this process is symbolized in the different religious paths of our ancestry. And that the ancestral religions, it's easy for us to disregard them because they've become hollow and they don't really express what is going on anymore. But really, once we start doing the work of dream analysis and individuation, then within us, these symbols starts coming back up again. And now we have a religious attitude towards our relationship with the self. So this religious, this word religion comes from the Greek religio, which means to connect with the divine, right? To understand something greater than us, we have that natural. And so this really marks a big, this work, Aion, marks a big shift in Jung's work from being a purely psychological description of what's going on in the first 9 volumes to volume 9.5, where now Jung speaks more and more about the religious function as being essential in the development of a relationship with the self and the God image. For Jung, the self and the God image were the same. Does that make sense?
Yes. The scientific part, of course, it is incredibly difficult to foresee for the layman, like he's saying. But ultimately, I do find that this is the genius how he is bridging one and the other together, and how it all actualizes in our own psychic process. And whether we like it or not, if it's not going to happen this lifetime, it's coming. It's not going to be inevitable.
And that aspect of Jung, it's what separates him from the rest of the psychologists and from Freud
I agree.
especially. It,
Yeah, I
it
agree.
that and that religious, and some of the books that he writes later on. And then as we go into Aion there, we're going to get into the astrological perspective of what he said. And, so it's, fascinating to see Jung's ideas unfold like this, huh? So let's keep going. The next file, I think we're almost done here. We're getting really close. It was something of a discovery to find that during the unconscious state of sleep, intervals occur called dreams, which occasionally contain scenes having a not inconsiderable resemblance to the motifs of mythology. For myths are miracle tales and treat of all those things which very often are also objects of belief. If metaphysical ideas no longer have such a fascinating effect as before, this is certainly not due to any lack of primitivity in the European psyche, but simply and solely to the fact that the erstwhile symbols no longer express what is now welling up from the unconscious as the end result of the development of Christian consciousness through the centuries. This end result is a true antimonum pneuma, a false spirit of arrogance, hysteria, woolly mindedness, criminal immorality, and doctrinaire fanaticism, a purveyor of shoddy spiritual goods, spurious art, philosophical stuttering, and utopian humbug, fit only to be fed wholesale to the massive man of today. That is what the post-Christian spirit looks like. That's how Jung ends it. And, being a revolutionary myself, I always so appreciate his ability to just tell it like it is. So I'll repeat this. This end result. So this is he's speaking about, and in his next volume, volume 10, Civilization and Transition, that's 600 pages of material about what he's speaking of right now, is what's going on in the collective. And then volume 11, Psychology and Religion. These two are really, really important books. Anyway, Jung, this is, for those of you who are just becoming introduced to Jung's work through the series, we're just touching the surface, really. But let's just read that quote again. This end result is a true antimonum pneuma, a false spirit of arrogance, hysteria, woolly mindedness, criminal immorality, and doctrinaire fanaticism, a purveyor of shoddy spiritual goods, spurious arts, philosophical stuttering, and utopian humbug, fit only to be fed wholesale to the mass man of today. That is what the post-Christian spirit looks like. Boom. Exhausted, my dear.
Um, you know what? No, I kind of I've recouped halfway through, and I'm trying to see how can we summarize to whoever actually lasted until the end of this video, where ultimately the order of the work, you know, the whole point of the self is that the ego is we have a healthy ego, and then as we integrate our shadows and as our ego begins to the sort of discrimination, I call it, drums the beat of this work. The self does not possess the ego does not possess the self, the syzygy between the masculine and the feminine come and play, and the shadows, is the playground of to understand it all, and the dreams, right?
Mm-hmm. Beautiful description. Beautiful description.
Because ultimately he's pointing towards understanding your feelings, understanding when your logos are overtaking you, understanding when your emotions are overtaking you, understanding the balance between the two, and then how much do you want to be in the conscious world and how much you want to be in the unconscious world, and you deem the consciousness, or you are in a conscious world and you want to deem the unconsciousness, then you do become a humbug.
well, well, he's saying that if you don't have the feeling
Hmm.
and you're only working from the intellectual,
Hmm.
then symbols lose their meaning and religion lose its meaning. and fairy tales and all of mythology loses its meaning because these things are not rational.
Mhm.
They
And
speak.
you cannot see them. But I've met an equal amount of people who were completely illogical. There is no intellect whatsoever, and they're completely overtaken by their emotions, and they cannot figure it out. Why are they feeling what they're feeling, and what is happening to them?
Well, that's what we were talking at the beginning of that's what Jung was talking about in the beginning of the video, being possessed, or
Mm-hmm.
or identifying with it,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
so there's the megalomania, and
Mm-hmm.
then there's the where we identify and we've become God, and then there's the possession and the neurotic behavior that these two things, they're neither of them are healthy, and then that we need the ability to discriminate, to
Mm-hmm.
know what is what. So
Mm-hmm.
intellect is important, but if we empower the intellect too much and we don't take account of the feelings, because the feelings, they help us understand,
Correct.
so that the feeling, to a point, is kind of like the voice of the soul. It's
Mm-hmm.
the voice of God, and so if we can withdraw the projections and analyze our feeling and talk about why am I feeling this way, then the window to the soul is opened up, and then we can give those things a voice. And yes, we have to be intellectually present and emotionally present. Like you said, something beautiful, emotional intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
That be what would happen to the world if we were emotionally intelligent? Huh? You know, wow, that would be something incredible.
Oh, for sure. For
I
sure.
think that's the meaning of Jung's work. I think we're coming to the end there. Any closing comments?
Um, I love the work.
I must agree with you completely. And it's
I
been
love the work.
fun sharing it with you. It's
Mm.
been very fun sharing it with our audience. If you made it all the way this way, congratulations. If you have questions or anything, please subscribe to the channel, do all of that good stuff. And if you need support, reach out. We have our information right here. Um, The Healer and the Dreamer, Astrology, Alchemy, Dreams, and Jung. And for a
Mhm.
long time, our channel was mostly all about astrology, but now finally we have a Jungian component. The Healer and the Dreamer weaves an insightful tapestry using astrology, alchemy, dream work, and the analytical psychology of Carl Gustav Jung to bring clarity to the path to self-realization in our modern times. I'm Martin Comtois with my wonderful and lovely friend Ina. What a journey. I appreciate your courage so much. And
Well, it takes two to tango.
it does. It makes the material so much richer to have your insight, but also to see you humbly being moved by the material like that. Huh? That was beautiful for you to do that. And onward and upward. We'll
Amen.
continue in the next few weeks there. We'll have some more episodes for you, but these first 4 episodes there, you got your work cut out for you in your studies for sure. Over and out. See you guys soon. Whoop, whoop.